Welcome to the Turnout, a series of interviews on issues that you can't afford to ignore. In this first episode, I speak with Mark Frankland, who was in the stadium on the day that the Hillsborough disaster happened. Hi Mark, how's it going?
It's okay, how are you?
Not too bad. So, the reason that I'd asked you to come on this time, you were on the Scottish Independence podcast before, but we've recently had the verdict on the Hillsborough inquiries. It's been a long time coming, but you were actually there that day. So, maybe we should start there. What was your experience on that day? How did the story unfold for you?
Well, I guess I was, unbelievably lucky, really. Like many fans, turned up at the ground. I wasn't late. I guess it was about 2:15. Got into the queue at the Leppings Lane end with ticket in hand, not drunk. And what they'd done the year before is that there's a yard outside the turnstiles, and so they would always put a line of policemen to restrict entry into the yard to break the crowd down, because there are only 6 turnstiles, all of them very dilapidated, to try and get 24,000 people through. And in previous years, I'd been 3 times to semi-finals at Hillsborough. That's what they'd done, and they got the crowd into the ground quite well. This time, because Duckinfield was in charge and he'd never been in charge of a football game before, that sort of crowd management system wasn't in place. And so a huge crush developed outside of the turnstiles. I was in the middle of that, managed to get to the edge by a wall. Remember saying to the guy I was with, I don't care if we miss the kickoff. I'm just, being in the middle of that is dangerous. And it became apparent that unless something was done, there was probably going to be fatalities in that crush. It was incredibly serious. At which point the police opened a door to see what was happening outside, to see how serious, and about 10 of us got popped through this door, a bit like, opening a champagne bottle. And 1 minute I'm outside in the crush, the next minute I'm inside and there's barely a soul in sight. And the lad I was with started walking towards the tunnel. At that point, the only obvious place to go is this tunnel. There's no indication that there's other parts of the terrace you could stand on. And just through sheer luck, I said, look, now, I was there last year. It's terrible. It gets really packed in there, which obviously are words which kind of came back to haunt me a bit. I said, let's go. We walk this way. We can stand at the edge and you get a better view. And really, the minute we turned to walk to the edge of the terrace was the minute that Duckinfield opened the gate. And there was this, great burst of people, all of whom went straight into the tunnel. We walked into one of the adjacent cages, and it was just the most, extraordinary experience in that where I was standing, it was barely full at all. There was open space around me. And yet, a mere 2 or 3 feet away on the other side of the cage, you were seeing people literally die in front of your eyes, with just about nothing you can do. Kind of thinking, I've got no medical training or anything like that. It's an experience which will never ever go away. One that's become increasingly familiar to me over recent years, because at First Base, the charity where I work, we have a project supporting veterans, and obviously, I've spent a lot of time with them as they go through sort of moments in their life when they've been involved in incredibly confusing, traumatic experiences. And, obviously it's always in the mind that if I hadn't happened to have been to the semi-final the year before and gone through that tunnel and stood in that central cage, then I would, and the guy I was with, would probably been 2 of the first to go, because we'd have been literally in the tunnel when the gate was open and would have had virtually no chance whatsoever.
One of the things I heard another survivor talking about in an interview was that he said that, lots of football fans who went to games in that period would talk about how, well, that could have been me because we were all treated badly and there was crushes in various other grounds. But the guy said, no, maybe those football fans don't understand, because there were times where it was uncomfortable before, but obviously that day was just a million times worse than anything you'd ever seen.
Well, to be honest, my experience as going to away matches at the time, I've often said at the time I was working in the animal feed industry, and it always made me chuckle to an extent is that if farmers were to treat their cattle in the way that we got treated on a Saturday afternoon, they'd have had the RSPCA round. It would have been deemed, you're not allowed to have Alsatian dogs move cattle. You're not allowed to pack them in the way we were packed in. The way the police treated football fans, it kind of beggars belief. I mean, I remember one event on that day which kind of painted a picture of the mood of the police on the day was when I was making my way to the ground. They had all the normal segregation in. So you had to sort of take this enormous great detour to get to the end where we were. And at one stage we were walking down a street which was parallel to the ground, and you could see down the sort of connecting streets that the ground was only about 100 yards away, something like that. And I was with my dad, who had quite chronic arthritis, and you could see down the street that his turnstile was just there. So he had the choice of either a 100-yard walk or what was almost a mile to go round the houses with all the sort of police segregation going on. And I went up to a couple of cops. The street was blocked by some fencing, and I just said, "Excuse me, mate. My dad's got a ticket for that stand there. As you can see, he's got arthritis. You couldn't just let him through, could you, mate?" And his response to me was, "Fuck off, you scouse bastard."
Hmm.
And I immediately kind of bridled at this, and then my dad sort of put his hand on my shoulder to guide me away, because it was pretty obvious if I'd said one more word, I'd have got just thrown in the van. And I again I can remember as we were making way up the street, Dad on his crutches, him saying, "We're in South Yorkshire." And I thought, how ridiculous, South Yorkshire, adjacent county to where I lived. And it was almost like he could have said, "We're in East Germany, we're in North Korea." But South Yorkshire at the time had this reputation as a place where the police essentially were out of control. After the way they behaved in the miners' strike, they had, quite literally become a law unto themselves. We knew that before the disaster. And of course, football fans in general had been demonized. Liverpool fans in particular, not only because of the way the city of Liverpool had kind of been portrayed and treated throughout the 1980s, but obviously because of the Heysel disaster as well. So, you really did feel and know you were on absolute enemy territory. And essentially, hindsight for me says that disaster was always going to happen somewhere, because if you take thousands of human beings and herd them into locked cages, it's always going to happen. I mean, it's mind-boggling to think of the conditions they put us in at the time. At the time, you were used to it. It's how it was. But in hindsight, if it hadn't happened at Hillsborough, it would have happened somewhere.
Hmm. And it's interesting, that mentality. You're not a human being. You're a threat to public order.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly the way we were always treated. Of course, there had been considerable amounts of football hooliganism throughout the 70s and the 80s, but it's the classic case. It was a small minority who were involved in that, but the response to it was to treat everybody in that way. I mean, remember, this was a time, and I think it was still being talked about, that football fans were going to have identity cards.
It's a form of
You know,
collective punishment.
yeah, yeah, and we would be the only members of society who, to have the right to travel from A to B, would have to carry the right identity. I mean, thankfully that never went through, but they wanted it to go through. That was the extent to which we were deemed, one of those enemies within. There was a lot of enemies within back in the 1980s, and football supporters were certainly one of them.
Yeah. And on the day itself, what do you remember about the actions of the police? Was it all bad? Were there some police that were trying to do the right thing? Was it orders coming from the top? What can you remember about the actions of the police on that day?
I mean, to be honest, the organisation, they were deployed to stop trouble. And were ready for trouble, which any football fan at the time would have told you was ridiculous. There's never going to be any trouble between Liverpool and Notts Forest. It's not two clubs with a history of that. And therefore, they plainly were not ready. The plans were all wrong. And their behaviour in the run up to the game was disgraceful, but that was usual. That was what you kind of expected. To be honest, I mean, I've always said that, having been in the crush outside the ground, the decision to open the gate, as far as I was concerned, was the correct decision. The guy made it under extreme pressure. He was totally inexperienced. He should never have been given the job. And Liverpool fans and the families even have always said, if only he'd owned up to the fact, "Look, I cocked up. we'd have all accepted that. It happens. People make mistakes, especially under pressure. I mean, what was, several things stick in my memory. I mean, it was when it was plainly obvious that people were crushed to the extent of probably they're going to die and were trying to climb out of the cages. I saw many policemen knocking them back in, using their batons to do that. Again, it's staggering when you still see the pictures. You see all these coppers who are, trained personnel. They should be trained to react in this kind of situation, just stood there, whilst it's the fans who are carrying stretchers, who are trying to give mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Their response when it became obvious what was happening was extraordinary. And I always remember that even at 100 yards away, it became apparent to the Nottingham Forest fans what was happening. And they started climbing out of their end to rip advertising hoardings off and to join the Liverpool fans as stretcher bearers. And the police response to that was to put a line of policemen along the centre line with dogs. And this was when, events were kind of already 15 minutes in. So it was the most diabolically poor reaction. But I think, a lot of the young coppers, and hearing several of them talk about it since, they were just totally and utterly shell shocked. But that initial decision to open the gate, which obviously was the biggest cause, as the jury confirmed last week, I would never disagree with that. I think he made the right call. What, of course, he didn't do, because he hadn't read the standing instructions, is they'd often had to open that gate at Hillsborough to avoid the crush outside. There was a plan in place, which has always been deployed, is that before you open the gate, you close the tunnel, and that will funnel the fans into the areas of terracing which are empty. He hadn't bothered reading his pre-match instructions and didn't make that order, even though the copper who was at the tunnel was begging him to do it, saying, "You sure you don't want me to close the tunnel?"
Hmm. So you're saying that opening that gate was the correct decision, but wouldn't it also have been the correct decision at that point to open the fences that were holding the Liverpool fans in? You're saying, the police were actually beating back in. Shouldn't there have been a simultaneous order to open the fence behind the goal?
I mean, this is why I say it was always going to happen. They actually did. The trouble is that the gate in that fence, for each cage, there was this gate which was about half the width of a door. One cage, it was rusted up and they couldn't open it. They tried to open it, they couldn't. But the other gate, they did open. But because it was so packed inside, it was taking them, I don't know, but looking, from what I can gather, maybe at least 2 minutes to get one person out. It wasn't like there was a great big 20-foot wide gate, which they could have opened and immediately started evacuating, lots of people. This was a tiny little thing. And obviously, when they designed the cage, no one had ever stopped to think what would happen if something went really badly wrong in there. There was no means for people to get out of it quickly.
Yeah, I read that the door in the fence, the very small one that you said, actually opened inwards, not outwards as well.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like it had been designed to make the thing happen. And to give credit to the health and safety people, that's why they didn't give the stadium a license. It had no safety license for the simple reason it wasn't safe.
And so if it wasn't given a license, how was the decision made to have the game there?
Well, there's massive questions which are going to be asked about Sheffield Wednesday. Obviously, the decision of which venue to use for the semi-final was down to the FA. The FA, for the second year on the trot, chose Hillsborough. They were supposed to show due diligence and make sure it had an up-to-date safety license. For some reason, they turned a blind eye to that. On the committee that made that decision, surprise, surprise, was the Sheffield Wednesday chairman.
Hmm.
Sheffield Wednesday at the time were pretty hard up, and they needed the gate receipt money, their share of it, for the semi-final. 2 and 2 probably makes 4.
Hmm. And so in the days following the disaster, what started to happen? I read some of the things you've written about the incident, and I also read the letter that you wrote to. Was it to the Parliament or was it to the police commissioner just shortly after it?
It was to anyone I could think of, to be honest. I sent it to several MPs, to quite a few journalists,
Hmm.
obviously the police. I mean, interesting enough, I wrote that letter, sent it. That was on the Monday morning, and those are the days when you just would type it on a typewriter. There was, if you weren't together enough to photocopy it and keep a copy and be an organised person with your paperwork. it's not like having a digital record as we have these days. And so I never kept a copy. I'd never seen it for